Hello, my name is Owen. Today I'll be doing a quick review of Fredrik Backman's The Winners. What I want to do is give a brief overview of what the book is about, tell you the things that I liked, and tell you the things that I didn't like. For the overview, this is the finale of the Beartown trilogy, and I kind of want to give my thoughts of like the overview of the series at the end, but sticking to this book, it follows the same cast of characters that were in book 1 and book 2, as well as introducing some new characters and new stories, kind of like what they did with book 2, where there's a couple main characters, and they sprinkle in some new characters that maybe you knew from the previous books, but you didn't get a POV on, or just like completely new characters. He does that again. The interesting thing about this one is that there was actually a 2-year time jump in between book 2 and book 3. So the characters are a little bit older. Our younger characters are a little bit more grown up. Overall, from book 1 to book 3, it was like 2.5 years, but the 2-year time jump happens in this book. And I thought it was a great decision. Going right into things that I liked, I really liked what the time jump did for refreshing this story. My major complaint of Us Against You was that it felt like it was retreading a lot of the same grounds and just felt overall unnecessary. And a 2-year time jump was exactly what we needed to just give a little bit of change, a little bit of movement to each of the characters to make their stories like take on a new direction and for them to feel fresh again, if that makes any sense. The characters aren't like largely changed, like there isn't like huge personality differences. In some cases, or in most cases, I would say some characters do seem a little bit different from the time jump, but Backman does like flashbacks of the time between, I'm particularly talking about the character of Amat. His arc in this book, I think, was like the strongest arc that he had, because at first he's like, oh, I'm a small kid, can't play hockey. Then he's like, I'm good at hockey, but like, what is my place? Or like, what, I don't know, like book 2, I forgot all of it. Not that it was bad, I just didn't think it was unnecessary, so I don't remember everything. But this book, he's like almost washed up. Went to the NHL tryouts, failed, and now what is he, right? And I really liked his character, and I really liked his story in this book. It's one of the highlights for sure. But that's something I really liked. I really liked the time jump, and I also liked what they did with the Beartown and Head rivalry. Again, we're like retreading the same ground of Beartown versus Head, hockey rivalry, but it's also about like society and stuff like that. It hits many of the same notes, again, which hit in Beartown, which hit in Us Against You, and it's back in here. But what Backman did this time is kind of like flip the roles in the time jump. Now Beartown's on top, Head's on the bottom, and I think for some reason that perspective shift made it feel fresh again, even though it's basically the same thing as like the first book, but in the second book, but like reversed. But I really liked it. We follow like a couple like Head people that live in Head, and a little bit about more their community, and it just feels like Star Wars in the sense that like it's like if the rebels like beat the Empire, but then now like the rebels are like repeating the same mistakes. I don't know why I made that analogy. It's just like Beartown, that they're in charge, like they make the same mistakes that Head made when they were in charge, and it's kind of like the irony, because now it's the people we know and we like in charge making decisions, with like Tails, or like the business owner, like he's like, I don't know what his deal is in this book, but for most of it, he's like straight up villain. Anyway, but that goes kind of into the things that I didn't like about this book. Because listen, things that I liked, Backman, he always writes a consistent story, a consistent level of quality story. His characters, I'm obviously deeply invested in them, and it's a conclusion. So I'm a little bit biased towards liking it, if I'm being honest. But I did think it was a better book than the second one. And if anything, it like retroactively improves book 2, but I'll get to that later. But things I didn't like about this book, going back about Tails, I thought it was strange like how much he was vilified in this book, and it seemed almost out of character, like how many bad, immoral decisions that he was making. He does like become a little bit more realistic as the book goes on, but in the beginning I'm like, really, they're making Tails the villain, like the grocery store owner, like that's the villain of this one? Because like last time, or the first time, it was kind of like Kevin's dad and like that grew up. In the second book it was like Theo and the politician and kind of like the pack and stuff like that. But this one I'm like, they're gonna make it Tails, and like spoiler alert for like this one, because I'm gonna spit some spoilers next couple minutes. Like Theo comes back and he is like a villain again, but there's also like journalists come in, so it ended up not being just Tails, which I was relieved. But like the first like quarter of the book, I'm like, I don't buy like this villain. I don't buy it. I don't buy that he's going to be the one that's causing so many issues. And they do redeem him at the end, and like he it ends up like explaining it because it's like he wanted to do it for the town, stuff like that. I don't really know if I completely buy it. But the other major thing that I didn't like with this book is like the thing Bachman did for the first two books and didn't bother me is when he spoils the end. And in this case, he spoils in the beginning of the book that Benji dies. And listen, I love Benji. I was sad to see him go. But the fact that I knew it and that he kept saying it again and again and again, he's going to die, he's going to die, he's going to die, it made his death so anticlimactic that I didn't even like feel anything. Like I felt more for Ramona's death in the beginning than I did for Benji's. And I think it's because he spoiled it. Like he could have done the classic like Bachman like hint at one thing, but it's actually the other meaning that you didn't think of. But like by telling us, I just don't know why he did that. Because it really took the weight out of it. Because like the scene where Benji dies, it's so like quick. And it makes sense to why it's quick. It's because we know what's going to happen. We don't need to linger on it. But it just felt like, okay, well that was it. Rip Benji. Because he didn't have like a big like he did have a heroic moment, but it wasn't like a final monologue before like something tragic. Like it was, you know what I mean? It was just like, this bad thing's going to happen. We know it's going to happen, and we know it's going to result in Benji's death. Bad thing happens. Benji dies. Oh, end of the book. Sad, right? It's like, yeah, it was sad when I read that on page 1. But now like, you let me sit with it for 600 pages, and now it's just like, it fizzled out. Don't get it twisted, though. This is a very good book and a very conclusion trilogy, and it makes sense how Benji ends up. But I just think for that particular plot point, you dropped the ball on the delivery, not the content, the delivery, which is unfortunate. Now, one thing I want to do is give a brief overview of like my thoughts about this series, and specifically why it worked so well for me overall. One thing I discovered after finishing this book, it's obvious, clear as day, this trilogy is about Maya. Clearly, she's like the focal character in book 1. And it's about Benji. And I think the reason why I didn't, even though I loved his storyline in book 2, was my favorite part, I think maybe the reason why I didn't feel like it was necessary is because I didn't realize how this story, this trilogy, was about Benji, as well as Maya. Because reading this book and like reading like him coming back to Beartown, it made me so grateful that I spent so much time with him in book 2 that retroactively I like it even more, if that makes sense. One thing I want to talk about is why I think Bachman's characters are so engrossing, because it's interesting. He doesn't have the most like deep characters. He doesn't have the most complex characters, but for some reason, the emotional connection is so deep, at least with me, to Bachman's characters. And I don't know, I didn't know exactly why that is, but I've come to the conclusion that it's because of how simple his characters are. And I don't mean that they're one-dimensional, that they're like caricatures of like a trait or something like that. But Bachman very clearly in his books, and this goes for his other books too, for Anxious People, for A Man Called Ove, almost forgot the name. He establishes their core traits. And that's not to say that they're not like multifaceted. Like I said, like they're not one-dimensional. That's not to say like even like their trait in itself isn't multifaceted and that they don't contradict themselves and like they're still human, right? But for example, talking about Benji again, Benji at his core is loyal and he's brave, right? Those are his core traits. So even from the very beginning when we introduced him in book 1, he's loyal to Kevin. He's not afraid to defend him. He's the one that gets in fights. But he's like a loner. Those are his traits from the very beginning, like as the hockey player. And like consistently, book 1, book 2, book 3, that's his character. And like different things happen to him, but he deals with them in the same way every time. And that's why it's like perfect. The way that he died is perfect for his character, because there was no world in which Benji did not walk in front or jump in front and tackle like the shooter and to save people's lives. There's no world in which that doesn't happen, right? Versus like a character, like if you go, like I'm reading Game of Thrones right now, if you go to a character like Jon Snow, who's also like very loyal and very honorable, right? But does he always jump on the sword? Like, probably not, because like George R.R. Martin's character is a little bit more complex. They're a little bit more gray. But the reason why Bachman's are, and I'm emotionally attached to both of these characters. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but the simplistic nature is that I know Benji because I know his core traits, and he establishes the core traits of all of his characters. So when they're put in a situation, it's inevitable what they're going to do. So the tragedy and the emotional investment in Bachman's characters is not in like what they're going to do, but it's like in the inevitability of what they're going to do when they're put in situations like this, right? And I just think it's fascinating how easily he's able to like hook readers into emotional investment in his characters. And part of that, don't get me wrong, part of that is due to his writing style of being very, just as an author, he's very perceptive of like human thoughts and human like emotions. Like he writes a lot about like motherhood. Like obviously he's not a mother, but he knows like at its core, like simplified, a mother will do anything for their kids. That's the simple trait. So like when he's talking like from Kira's point of view or for Hannah's POV in this book, he knows like for these characters, that's what motivates them. So their decisions and for Kira and like her and Peter's like falling out, it's because she cares for her child deeply, and in the first book, the worst thing in the world happens to her daughter, and she can't do anything about it. So there isn't a world where Peter and Kira don't get angry, where they don't try to get even, where they don't try to compensate, where they get overwhelmed, where they get lost, because this is their thing, and like something happened to them where that thing was like put into the test or put in challenges, stuff like that. It's just fascinating, and honestly, there's no other author that does character quite like Bachman, and it's just fascinating to me that it's not due to like the uniqueness of his characters. Like I'm sure you could find in many books the friend who's kind of dumb but he's sweet, and it's Bobo in like this series, right? It's like, oh, it's Bobo. Like he's so like a simple character, but I'm emotionally invested in him when he gets a girlfriend that I just met in this book. Why? He's a side character through and through, right? But you just know from first book he had some growing up to do in the first book, but in the third book, right? So he meets this girl, and there's tension between Beartown and Head, and so like you could think like, oh, like what if they like break up? Like what if he's like goes back to his old ways? No, because for some reason Bachman convinces us Bobo is Bobo. At this point, he's going to be nice. He's never going to disappoint her. And like he'll even go far as say that like they're going to have kids and stuff like that. And the fact that he like jumps into the future to like assure us like things work out, and he does this all the time with Maya. It's like from the very first book, it's like this horrible thing's happened to her. 30 years down the line, she's the biggest pop star in the country. And I sometimes I think it's strange that he like gives away their future, but like on reflection, it just as another tool he uses to like cement these characters so that we know them, and from that knowing, it allows us to more easily invest in it. So let me know what you guys think of that rambling. I think it's super unique, and if you know any other authors that maybe do something similar or do something unique with their characters, let me know. And also, if you want to, feel free to subscribe. It actually does help a lot, and I appreciate it. Thank you.